Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Tim, the Growth Lab, everyone, thank you for having me to talk about Saudi Vision 2030. And I think it's a sort of a timely time to talk about Saudi Vision 30 for multiple reasons. One of them is we're 8 years away from the launch of the vision, so we already have enough data to monitor progress. The vision was launched in 2016 for targets in 2030. So 2024 is more than halfway point. And it's good just to assess again progress in terms of where Saudi is versus where it wants to be. As you may know, the Middle East is not the most stable or calm regions. And thinking about Saudi, thinking about the stability of Saudi and the prosperity of Saudi and the success of Saudi is something that's important to anyone who's doing their studying or looking or monitoring the Middle East. And I think it's important also to look at that context. And the final thing is what happens in Saudi is important for the global economy. It's important because money that comes from Saudi and the rest of its neighbors can make or break some IMF deals and some countries, stabilize some countries. Money that Saudi is a major player in the oil market. We saw it actually today. Today there was an OPEC Plus decision, which motivated by the stuff I'm going to be talking about in a bit. And it's not just developing countries or commodity markets. How Saudi invests its money and the rest of the GCC, how they invest their money matters even for the biggest economy in the world and the deepest market in the world, the US debt market. So for these reasons, it's great for the Growth Lab to arrange this, and I thank them for having me to discuss this. So what am I going to be talking about? In the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be making 3 claims. The claims are the following. First, I would claim that Saudi Vision 2030 is about many things, but there's a single most important target that is important for Saudi Vision 2030, which is the fact that they want to reduce the economy's dependence on oil. So that's one thing. The second claim I'll be making is I'm going to look at some diversification measures, and I'm going to argue that Saudi has become more or less dependent on oil since 2016. And the third claim I'll be making is I'll look at the reasons why Saudi has become more dependent on oil since 2016. I'll look at the spending that they've been making. I'll look at the domestic politics and the social contract, which is important. And I'll look at the sectors they chose to diversify into and how that overlaps with the rest of the region. These are the 3 claims I'm going to be making in the next 20 minutes. But before doing this, I'm going to be narrowing myself down to the diversification question. But it's also important to acknowledge that a lot of things have happened in Saudi Arabia since 2016. A lot of them were actually very good. And it's important to name them just before we delve into the diversification question. So let me name, 3 examples. The first one is women participation in the labor market. This has doubled since 2016. In 2016, female labor force participation in Saudi Arabia was low at less than 18% of the working age population. Today, it's nearly 36%. It has nearly doubled in 8 years. And that is important not just for the economy, but that's also important for the general society and the welfare if you look beyond the economy. The second good thing that happened in Saudi Arabia is that the government has actually increased its non-oil revenues. Non-oil revenues were about $50 billion in 2016. Today, they're over $100 billion in 2024. So non-oil revenues have more than doubled in 8 years, and that's something that has to, again, be acknowledged and applauded. And the third thing that happened in Saudi Arabia, many economists looking at aspiration and results, we can't do this without data. And data has improved significantly in Saudi Arabia since 2016. They publish more data, it's broader, it's more accurate, it's more timely. You compare Saudi Arabia to its neighbors in the GCC, the data are far better than the rest. Saudi Arabia is obviously a bigger economy, it's a G20 economy, so there's still some way to go towards getting the data up to the G20 standards, but you can see that the effort they're making towards improving the data and towards making some of this analysis possible is useful, especially for me as an economist. I'm not sure if you're going to grow that. So with that in mind, and there is a lot of targets for Vision 2030. There is a lot of programs. One of them, for example, the National Transformation Program,
program has 96 goals. We're not going to announce 96 goals. I think that the central goal for Saudi Vision 2030 is the idea of reducing the economic dependence on oil. Why do I say this? Saudi Vision 2030 was launched in 2016. 2016 was a year of low oil prices, a year in which Saudi Arabia was running a very large budget deficit. And it's clear that the centrality of the idea of diversification away from oil was front and center to the Saudi vision. And it's not just me speculating. If you actually look at the vision itself or statements from Saudi officials, you can see that very clearly. So if you go into this Vision 2030 website and actually download the vision, there's a forward by the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And in the third paragraph, immediately, he mentions that diversification away from oil is, it's mentioned very high up. If you look at press statements when the vision was launched in 2016, you can see this quote from, again, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, which I can't read here, it's too small. He says, I think by 2020, oil stops being supply. Now, there's a lot of ambition in that statement. There's a lot of ambition inside Vision 2030, but that's not what counts. The point here is the centrality of decoupling economic performance away from oil. And that's what happened when the vision was launched in 2016. And that hasn't changed over the years. A recent statement by the finance minister, Hamid al-Jadan, that was in 2023. And he said, our aim is within the period to 2030, we don't even look at the oil price. So again, stuff was said in 2016, and that goal hasn't changed. The goal of Saudi Vision 2030 is to reduce the economic dependence on oil. And I hope I've convinced you of that. So if that's the case, how has Saudi failed towards that goal? And I'm going to show you two measures here. The first measure is the price of oil that Saudi Arabia needs to avoid budget deficits. So if you think about it, if Saudi Arabia needed at one point in time an oil price of $50 per barrel to avoid deficits, and another time it needed 80. When it's at 80, it's clearly more dependent on oil than it was at 50. So I calculate this number on a quarterly basis. Saudi publishes quarterly budgetary numbers. I calculate that on a quarterly basis. They've actually recently published their budget for 2025. So we have the full estimates for 2024. And this is what it looks like. It's the white line. So the white line shows that Saudi Arabia today, 2024, needs an oil price of $93 per barrel to balance its budget. Now, a few things you can see here. First, $93 to avoid deficits is higher than the current market price. The average oil price in the market this year is about 80. Today is about 72. 93, Saudi Arabia needs an oil price of $93 per barrel to avoid deficits. And the oil price averaged $80 per barrel in the market. That means Saudi Arabia is running budget deficit, and indeed it is. The second thing you see is that 93 is higher than the price that Saudi Arabia needed in 2016 to avoid deficit, which is 91. So if you measure oil dependence by that price, then it has gone up slightly. And the third thing is the orange line, which is important. So what is happening in Saudi is a lot of the capital spending is not happening just through the central government, but it's happening through the sovereign wealth fund, the public investment fund, the PIF. And if you add domestic spending by the public investment fund to the spending by the Ministry of Finance, and you try and calculate the oil price that is needed to fund the spending, you get the orange line. And that price is around $108 per barrel. Mm-hmm. So you add all of this up, whether you want to include the sovereign wealth funds or not, Saudi Arabia needs an oil price of nearly $100 per barrel today to balance its budget versus 90-something dollar per barrel in 2016. It is higher. That indicates more oil dependence today versus 8 years ago. So that's one measure of oil dependence. The second measure of oil dependence is, instead of looking at the government budget, then we look at imports and exports. So let's calculate the price that the whole of Saudi Arabia needs to fund its imports. So if you think about it, there's money going back to Saudi Arabia to pay for imports. And because you have lots of foreign workers in Saudi Arabia, they send remittances. So these are the outflows from Saudi Arabia. And you need to offset these outflows with inflows from exports. Some of these exports are oil, some of them are not. And what is the price that will make these two flows equal? And that's what I can calculate next. Again, this is something that I can calculate from the balance of payments data, which is published on a quarterly basis. The latest numbers we have are from the June this year. And that number is about $75 per barrel. And what do you see here? You see that this number is the highest, almost the highest since 2012. So if you compare Saudi today versus 2016, or more dependence on oil in Saudi Arabia today versus 2016. Or these two sort of measures of dependence explain a lot of stuff that's happening in the market this year and the Saudi Arabian financial markets. So, for example, Saudi Arabia is running a large budget deficit and is doing a lot of spending through the public investment fund. But also, Saudi Arabia has been quite active in financial markets this year, raising debt and equity. So the Saudi Arabia sovereign is one of the largest issuers in emerging markets. The public investment fund issued debt in financial markets. Both of them sold shares in Saudi Aramco this year, raising funds. And there's a lot of fundraising happening in Saudi Arabia, and this chart basically explains it. There's also, if you think about the news today, so the idea is that Saudi Arabia needs an oil price somewhere between $75 and $100 per barrel, either to fund its imports or to fund its budget deficit. But the oil market is getting an oil price at $82. And what do? How do you respond to that? To the gap between the oil price that you need and the price that the market is giving you? You try and restrict supply in order to prop up prices. And that's what OPEC Plus did exactly today. Not for the first time. So OPEC Plus was supposed to increase oil supply into the market. You get Harvard, you know that if you increase supply, prices come down. So, and they don't want prices to come down. So what did they do? In October, they were supposed to increase oil supply. They didn't. They delayed that to December. In December, they didn't. Delay that to January. Today, they delayed that from January to April. And these pictures tell you there is a price that Saudi Arabia needs for oil, and there's a price that the market is giving it. And the gap between the two is what is pushing this policy towards restricting oil supply. Okay, so these are two measures of oil dependence. Now, there is a measure of oil dependence that we shouldn't be using. And the reason I mention it is because it gets quoted a lot. So often you hear that Saudi Arabia or another country in the region, a large share of the economy, most of the economy is non-oil activities, or that non-oil growth, the growth of non-oil sectors in Saudi Arabia is 4 or 5%, and that's a sign, an indication of diversification or independence from oil. Do not use that measure. Why is that? Think about the logic. If Saudi Arabia exports oil and uses the money from export to build new cities and to build new towns, then construction will go up. Construction is considered an oil activity, or as funded by oil money. If the oil money dries up, construction activity will slow down. Take another example. Of Saudi Arabia exports oil, gets the money from oil, and hires a lot of people in public sector jobs. Government services count as non-oil activity, but it's clearly funded by oil money. If the oil money dries up, then this activity is going to slow down. So this is the logic of it. But also empirically, this holds. When oil prices are low, non-oil growth, which at first hand the name suggests that's independent of oil, is low. So when oil prices are between $20 or $40 per barrel, you get a non-oil growth of about 1.6%. When oil prices are high, about $100 per barrel, you get non-oil growth at around 8%. And between these two numbers, non-oil growth rises in line with oil prices. So never use non-oil growth, the share of non-oil in GDP, as a measure of diversification, because non-oil activities in Saudi and in the region in general is funded by oil money. Okay, so I hope I've established that the central theme of Saudi Vision 2030 is diversification away from oil. I've convinced you that if you look at two measures of diversification or dependence from oil, that Saudi Arabia is more dependent on oil today than it was in 2016 when the vision was launched. I think we'll need the mic to.
No, I have a loud voice. Can you just say a few words about why the vision is to be less dependent on oil? What element is behind that vision? Or, for example, if they understand that the oil would be replaced by alternative energy, or
So the vision was launched 2016 at a time when oil prices were low. At a time when oil prices were low because there was a lot of supply. And if you're Saudi or any country in the region that exports oil, you know one thing: oil prices are volatile for whatever reason. Sometimes it's energy transition, sometimes it's US shale, sometimes it's a global recession. And if your economic performance is so coupled with oil prices, it is painful on the way down, and it's good on the way up, but you get the pain of going down. So this is the idea of diversification. And they've experienced that multiple times. It wasn't just 2016, it's multiple times. And obviously looking ahead, and the challenge of energy transition and the move towards renewables presents a threat. It may or may not impact oil prices, but it's definitely not the only one. Okay, so Saudi Arabia wants to diversify away from oil. If you look at different measures of diversification, it doesn't show. It shows Saudi is more dependent on oil than 2016. Why has that happened? I'll give you 3 reasons. The first one is spending. Saudi has been spending a lot post-pandemic. Remember non-oil revenues, how they've more than doubled since 2016? Well, spending has outpaced non-oil revenues. So basically, if you increase non-oil revenues by a certain amount, spending has increased by more. So oil now not only does it need to fund the oil spending, but also the new gap between spending and non-oil revenue. And this has contributed to the increase in the price of oil that Saudi Arabia needs to balance its budget. When the government spends more, part of the spending is on domestic stuff, part of the stuff is on imports. And as you increase your spending, your imports go up, and the price of oil that you need to fund these imports also goes up. Now, one of the themes of this year has been that Saudi Arabia has realized this because the oil market is moving downwards, whereas their spending needs are high. So one of the themes is this year is that Saudi Arabia is revisiting a lot of projects and saying, okay, this is a priority project, we're going to continue. This project we're putting on hold. This project is still we're doing, but we're doing it slowly. And these projects we're going to cancel. So they're trying to rationalize the spending. But it's also important to note, so this is like the past and the present, but let's look into the future. And Saudi Arabia has major global events coming up. They come over the coming decade. Saudi Arabia is hosting the 2027 Asian Football Cup. Saudi Arabia is hosting the 2029 Asian Winter Cups in Neom, the futuristic city of Neom. So there will be a ski resort in Neom. And that requires, some construction. Saudi Arabia is hosting the World Expo in 2030. And it is likely, this hasn't fully decided, but it's the only candidate, it will likely to host the World Cup, the Football World Cup in 2034. A lot of events. Now, it's not the only country in the region that has done this. Other countries have done it. For example, Qatar hosted the World Cup in 2022. So we can learn from, Saudi Arabia can learn something from the experience of Qatar. And what is the experience of Qatar teachers? 2 things. 1, Qatar was only the World Cup, not all 4 events. And the Asian Cup actually, so 2 out of the experience of Qatar teaches us 2 things. 1, hosting these events is costly. Qatar spent somewhere between $200 and $300 billion in the build-up to the World Cup. Not all of it on stadiums, obviously. They built a new airport, a port, a new road network, a new metro, not just for the World Cup, it's been used before and after, but in the build-up for the World Cup. Other economy is much smaller than Saudi. It's scaled $200, $300 billion. Other spent, we're talking about more than $1 trillion for Saudi Arabia in the coming decade. And if you read the reports, these are the numbers that people talk about in terms of the pipeline of projects that are coming in Saudi Arabia. So that's the first experience of Qatar. Building that stuff is costly. Or the second lesson from Qatar is that you may end up with excess capacity. So at a time when the whole GCC is booming, when real estate prices are going through the roof in Dubai and increasing gradually in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh and Saudi, or real estate prices are actually stagnating / falling in Qatar. Housing inflation in Qatar is negative versus 10% in Saudi and 7% in Dubai probably. So you do a lot of spending and there's a risk you might end up with assets that doesn't give you a return, but they end up being a liability because you have excess capacity. It doesn't mean that Saudi Arabia will do exactly the same thing, but it's a risk. And hopefully Saudi will learn from the experience of Qatar that it phases out the spending and doesn't end up with excess capacity. So that's the first reason why you had basically Saudi is more dependent on oil today than it was in 2016. The second reason is politics. Now, the reasons why Saudi Arabia spending increased wasn't just because it decided to spend on sports and entertainment on hosting global events. There is a strong push factor that gets Saudi Arabia to spend more on oil prices are higher. And this is the domestic politics. You see, oil doesn't just create an economic system, it creates a social contract, both in Saudi Arabia and in the rest of the region. In Saudi Arabia, the implicit social contract is the government will provide economic benefits to citizens, the citizens will provide political obedience to an absolute monarch. And that social contract, when oil prices increase and they become high, puts sort of implicit pressure on the government to increase that. And again, this is not just Saudi Arabia, it's the whole region. Oil doesn't just create an economic system, it creates social contracts and it creates political institutions. The question is, do these political institutions are created by oil? Are they good, conducive for long-term growth or not? Well, luckily we have a Nobel Prize winners this year in economics that tell us what kind of political institutions we need for long-term growth. They gave us the framework. So Acemoglu and Robinson told us in their book, Why Nations Fail, that for long-term economic development, you need political institutions that satisfy two conditions. One, they need to be pluralistic, so they allow a wide distribution of power in society. And two, they need to be stable to protect property rights and to enforce the rule of law. How does the region fare? So this is my interpretation of Acemoglu and Robinson. As you go right, you become more democratic. As you go up, you become more stable. Saudi Arabia satisfies one of these conditions. It's basically stable, but it's not pluralistic. And you can see most of the region actually is to the left. So most of them, you don't have that plurality. And there's a reason that there are trends, whether it comes from oil and other stuff, covering this whole region. But most of the Middle East is there, and Saudi Arabia is there. So the political institutions that are created by oil are not conducive for long-term growth. And you can see it in multiple things. You see it in the fact that there's spending, political pressure on spending. You see the productivity numbers, which are not very high. Whether you look at studies by the International Labour Organization or the report by the IMF, or the stuff I do, no matter how you slice it, productivity numbers are not great in the region, and this is one of the reasons why this is the case. The question is, are there any plans to change this? No. So while I think there is a genuine or desire in Saudi Arabia to diversify away from oil, absolutely, I believe that. For the reasons I was mentioned, they come through multiple, oil cycles. They've seen what decline in oil prices does, and they don't want to go through that again. They want to diversify away from oil. They don't want to change the fact that the political system is stable but lacking in plurality. So that's why they're looking for sectors that give stuff like oil. That's why they're looking for mining of metals, and they're looking for renewables. And they're beefing up the sovereign wealth funds because it's giving them return that looks like oil. You get stuff from abroad that goes mainly to the government and doesn't require much labor. So I mentioned two reasons why Saudi Arabia hasn't managed to has increased its dependence on oil rather than decreased it. One is higher spending. The second one is the political sort of institution. The last thing I have to mention is that the whole region, the whole of GCC, the 6 countries, they're going for the same sectors. So there's 5 or 6 sectors in the region that everyone's going for. Everyone wants to be a financial. Everyone wants to be a destination for tourism. Everyone wants to move up the hydrocarbon value chain towards petrochemicals instead of crude oil or raw gas. Everyone wants to be a logistics hub. Everyone wants to be an AI/technology center. And if you try to think about it, it makes sense, right? So what happens at these countries with consultants, the economic structure is very similar, and you will get the same answer. But the question is, how many financial centers does the Gulf Cooperation Council need? You already have one in Dubai, there was one in Manama. Doha is trying to be one, Riyadh is trying to be one. Do you really need 4 or 5 in a small sort of geography within the same, almost similar time zone? I don't know. How many mega airports do you need in the region? You have 2 great airlines, maybe 3. Do you really need more? I don't know. How many mega ports do you need? You've got Dubai, and you've got Oman, and you've got Saudi. Do you really need 3 mega ports? I don't know. So this is the third reason. It's instead of getting integration, you're getting sort of everyone is trying to crowd into the same sector. And what that creates is regional competition. So you get something like, Saudi Arabia, since last year, has enforced a rule that if you want to get contracts with the government, you need to have your regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia. This is exactly because everyone is trying to move into the same sense. So our spending, social contract, and regional competition are the reason why Saudi Arabia become more dependent on oil today than 2016. I'll just summarize and conclude. I think the summary of what I said is basically 3 numbers, 1, 2, and 3. I think there is one fundamental goal for Saudi Vision 2030, which is basically to reduce dependence on oil. There are two measures for oil dependence, and both of them point to the fact that Saudi has become more oil dependent and less over the last 8 years. There are three reasons why that happened: higher spending, political institutions, and regional competition. Now, to conclude, does that mean oil prices, if they come down tomorrow, we should write off Saudi? Absolutely not. I think one thing that you have seen in the region is you've seen this sort of agility and innovation. There is sort of this realization there is political constraints, but the region has been actually, Saudi and the rest of the Middle East, has been actually good at economic survival and at times economic prosperity within these political constraints. So, for example, you look at Saudi, and they realize that oil prices have come down. They need to build up the sovereign wealth fund. They're getting almost 10% of the oil exports from the sovereign wealth fund. That's better than zero. You look at, for example, a country like Bahrain. When oil revenue started to come down, they started reclaiming more land and generating more land, more income out of land reclamation. You look at a country like Egypt, when its gas fields started to dry up, and the Suez Canal started to lose revenue. They started selling land to foreigners, and that could help them get over a crisis. So within the political constraints that are imposed on the region and they impose on themselves, I think they've been quite creative in generating new sources of revenue that gives them economic survival while maintaining the sort of political system. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
I will share some reflections from some of our work that we have done with the Ministry of Economy and Planning in Saudi Arabia for the past since 2016, and then we will get into a Q&A. So I will keep this very brief, and I think it really highlights that this is not a conversation that the region is privileged to have. How do we define what we mean by the oil economy, how it pertains to, but also it seeps into the non-oil economy? And I really commend that thinking about how we measure these problems is a major, not just a talking point, is a major need for the region and how we think about the dynamics of oil economies. So I'm going to reflect on two core points of what it means to how an oil economy is not just about the sectors and government spending, how it seeps into your form of the immigration system and how it seeps into all different areas of policy, that when you're trying to diversify away from oil, complicates that picture even further, as was nicely highlighted today. So this is perfectly aligned with what you just showed. We need to be understanding what is the fundamental driver of the economy. The Saudi economy does not have many drivers of growth. It largely has had and it's also, part of the challenge for Vision 2030 is that it's not being driven by quantities of oil. If you actually measure quantity of oil exports per capita, Saudi Arabia now exports 60% of its peak in 1991. So oil quantities are not going to be a driver of growth in the medium term. So you have to therefore rely on oil prices. And we all know the challenge of relying on oil prices as a fundamental factor of your economic growth itself. So then when we think of how oil seeps its way into the non-oil economy, well, it's very clear that the main driver of the non-oil economy, as shown here, is the level of net government expenditures. There is a very close correlation between the level of government spending or your fiscal impulse and the size of your non-oil GDP. So again, this is how oil primarily seeps its way into the non-oil economy. That, as was perfectly highlighted, we don't have a system in which you have multiple drivers of growth, and you actually have one central driver of growth, and that is the level of your fiscal impulse. So that creates two very different effects. One is during periods of high oil prices, as we saw from 2014 to 2011, you do get a large level of government spending that then allows what we call the non-tradable sectors. This is your construction, your retail. This is the majority of the private sector in Saudi Arabia. Hits boom times as well, and they're able to grow nicely. But what happens during times of fiscal contraction? On the right side there, you see that as the government pulls back its spending, it is the non-tradable sector that also takes a bigger hit, and the only source of growth is your non-oil tradable sector. And I would pose to you the challenge that Saudi Arabia faces in the medium term is that we are going to be living in the right side picture of fiscal contraction, not in a picture of fiscal expansion, despite the attempts to continue that fiscal spigot in the short term in the past couple of years. So in this context of fiscal contraction, the reason we need to focus on non-oil diversification is that that is going to be the only driver of growth, and it is going to be much harder times for the non-tradable sectors of construction and retail when the fiscal impulse is negative, as we expect it to be. So this is further proof that we had not planned this presentation together, because this is precisely the slide that sends Professor Ricardo Hausman through the roof. That the last country to spend far beyond your means, or to be spending at a consolidated rate of $112 when oil is at 80, is Venezuela. And we all, unfortunately, know how Ricardo has suffered watching Venezuela be half the size of the economy that it used to be. So this should be sending warning signals out there that we need to carefully look at a consolidated public sector perspective. And that's precisely a perspective that has been very hard to measure in the past, but one that can guide better actions and better policies moving forward. So as was nicely, if I had to summarize Vision 2030, I think it's the right solution of diversification, but to an undefined problem of why is diversification not required. So again, if we had to define it, it's because oil cannot be the fundamental driver of growth in the medium term. Quantities are falling per capita. Prices is not the way you want to grow an economy. And so, what then? How has Vision 2030 evolved? Well, initially, there was a major push to say, we want to focus on 2030 diversification that had to confront the falling fiscal revenues that oil prices have fallen. And they needed to immediately turn the lens to a new priority, and that was fiscal balance. So the government came up with a fiscal balance plan, 1.0, 2.0, and quickly decided we need to put the brakes on spending, and we need to restore fiscal balance. That's priority number one. This was around 2017, 2018. This became a top priority for government. As you pull back your government spending, what happens to the non-oil economy? We hit a recession. So what does the government then say? We need to restore short-term growth. And as in the middle of all of this picture, we realize that a lot of short-term stimulus spending is not achieving some of the 2030 diversification. So now we need to do Vision 2030 2.0 and create some of the new mega and giga projects that are there as well. And then finally, throughout all of this picture is the challenge of saudization. That 83% of the private sector is expatriate labor, exile labor. And how can we explain in a system with excess demand for labor the fact that we have Saudi unemployment? So the government put in many direct efforts to try to increase the rate of saudization. And I think one of the fundamental challenges in Saudi today is the lack of recognition that these are competing objectives, and that trying to achieve one actually makes some of the other objectives more difficult. But the one objective here that actually is pointing in the right direction is the approach to diversification. That if you were able to achieve diversification, it is more likely you would achieve higher saudization, you would achieve new sources to improve the fiscal balance, and to stimulate growth. But if you push heavy on saudization, it is not obvious that you will achieve further diversification. The Saudi workforce is a higher wage sector, so you're imposing higher costs into your private sector. That is not obvious that you're opening more opportunities for diversification in that direction. And these are some of the conflicting ways in which all of these positive objectives might actually come into competing goals moving forward. The final tip that we want to share is how we at the Growth Lab think about what we call the product space, or this kind of map of technological similarities, in which we map all of the different products produced in the world. And then you see that those two products that are close together are often co-produced in the same location. So we see textiles in the bottom right there. If you produce shirts, the place often knows how to produce pants, produce suits. But very far away from that is automotives in the center, and to the left, electronics. So very few places that produce apparel also produce electronics. And then there at the end of the world, in the top middle there, is oil. And so what that means is that very few places that produce oil also produce some of the chemical sectors. Very few places that produce oil also produce plastics, because the cost of labor between a country that produces plastics like Bangladesh and Saudi Arabia, that difference is higher than the cost of shipping oil from Saudi Arabia to Bangladesh. So what we learned by looking at, this through a product lens perspective is that the lack of diversification also presents challenges in terms of how easy it is for you to take the know-how you have today and to enter new opportunities. That the low diversification and the fact that few industries require the same know-how as digging a hole and trying to find oil also complicates the challenges of what sectors will be easy for you to jump and use the know-how you have today to move into those sectors. So we also want to be thinking beyond the macro fiscal, some of this investment side. What is the challenge of coordinating diversification? Also sees a challenge on the know-how side of the equation as well. So those are a few reflections, and now we'll have an open Q&A, and we have some nice questions from Zoom as well, and we will continue.
Thank you, Tim and Ziad. I really appreciate your valuable insights, especially the growth lab complexity theory, which we are learning in Div 130. I didn't quite get why we're disregarding the non-oil growth. As you know, it is a measure of economic diversification. So why should we care if the sovereign wealth fund is funded by oil or something else? Isn't this a tool for economic diversification, as we've seen in like Norway and other oil-dependent countries that went through economic diversification to some degree? If we're converting oil wealth to infrastructure projects and other economic engines that in the hope that we would steer away from oil, isn't that economic diversification? So if you can take us a bit through why you think that oil has become even more dependent in Saudi Arabia.
So the fundamental reason is that all of these sectors are funded by oil money. And when oil money drops, when oil prices drop, these activities drop. So if, for example, construction was able to become self-funded and it's unrelated to the movement in construction sector, it's unrelated to the movement in oil prices, then obviously that's going to be a diversified sector. But currently, as we're seeing, the non-oil sectors in Saudi Arabia are heavily linked to oil prices. When oil prices are low, you get slow growth in these sectors. When oil prices are high, you get high growth in these sectors.
I mean, naturally, yeah, but like the projects after they materialize, that's the role of the economic diversification.
You're much smarter than me, Nora, because you're thinking about the future. I'm looking at things as they are now, and as things stand, these sectors are linked to oil prices. Maybe in the future this relationship will change. I'm monitoring this, but as of now, it hasn't.
So this is the concept of tradable versus non-tradable that I think is, I've spent years with ministers trying to sit down and just translate this concept. So it's not oil, non-oil, it's tradable, non-tradable. That if a supermarket wants to move into Saudi Arabia, it has to locate there to access its customers. If you are shipping air conditioners, you can make those air conditioners anywhere and ship them to the customers in Saudi Arabia. So these two sectors are going to depend on different sources of what we call aggregate demand, right? One is dependent on the level of domestic purchases for supermarkets, and a different one is, the global demand for air conditioners. So if you start imposing higher saudization restrictions, the non-tradable sectors will pass that off directly to consumers, but that air conditioner group cannot pass that to consumers because it depends on global demand and global prices for air conditioners. They will either relocate or shut down operations if prices become too high. So these concepts of how we think about different policies and how they affect different sectors, we need to narrow the lens to understand that the only sector that can drive growth is growth that comes from global demand, and that is what we call the non-oil tradable sector. And that sector is very sensitive to policies, and that sector is not necessarily the end goal of many of the current spending on diversification today. So we think of, we can even think of tourism, finance, those are still tradable services. But narrowing the lens to realize that construction is not one of those sectors, and that right now the majority of employment in Saudi Arabia is in these non-tradable services, means that we'll increasingly come into a tension between the economy of the past and keeping that alive, which was a tension in 2019. 2019, the construction sector had gone through 16 consecutive sectors of negative growth because it's so dependent on domestic spending, and domestic spending was negative during that period. So there aren't multiple sources of demand for the construction sector that is highly dependent on the fiscal impulse. And we need to be thinking about diversification into the sectors that actually depend on global demand and have a potential to continue, economic growth in the medium term. I'll take these 3 questions. Yes.
I love planet Earth, but I'm going to play the devil's advocate for 2 minutes. I sometimes see policy practitioners falling into this trap of, falling in love with a solution, say diversification, and then trying to apply it in every context. I think one key difference between economies in the Middle East and, say, Venezuela, or even the economies in Acemoglu's book, is that the budget constraints of these countries don't bind. They are wealthy. And so maybe a way to think about this would be to go along a different route, as to think about how to take those oil revenues and invest them for the future, or invest them for the kind of development that Saudi wants to bring about, rather than trying to find new industries to develop from scratch right now. So the example that comes to mind is something like Norway, where they've put their oil reserves to a varied stream of users and industries. So what are your thoughts on taking that approach?
Fantastic. Let's take a couple, just because we're going to reach an hour before we let in.
So thank you very much for the talk. I really like this tradable, non-tradable distinction, which I thought was very helpful for MEP to think about. My question is on the kind of the sectors that are in that gray zone, where oil-derived, non-oil tradables. This one is very easy for Saudi to expand into because they kind of have a competitive advantage. But on the other hand, it's ultimately dependent on oil. And then there's other one that's non-oil derived, non-oil tradables that's very, Saudi might not have competitive advantage in, but that can really truly diversify itself away from the oil sector. So given these 2 types of non-oil tradable sectors, where do you think they should focus on?
Yeah, my question is brief. I'm just curious if there's a mega project that you're looking at right now that is a model, maybe within traded goods sector, something that you think is long-term and sustainable, that maybe the future planning administrations can think about replicating projects like that, that's already up right now.
Fantastic.
Right. Couple of points. I think you mentioned that the budget constraint is not binding. I've been in the Middle East for too long, and budget constraints do bind. In 2016, Saudi Arabia was running a budget deficit in excess of 10% of GDP. That is huge, $100 billion of deficit. Today, Saudi Arabia, 2024, is one of the largest issuers in emerging markets of debt. But running a budget deficit. I don't think they wanted to widen. And if you think about their oil policy, it just tells you that the budget constraint was not binding. They would not be delaying oil production. They would be just fighting for market share in the oil market instead of reducing production and losing out to other competitors who don't have the comparative advantage. And to take an extreme example, it's not Saudi. I'm from Iraq. I've seen the budget constraint binds. In 2020, Iraq ran out of money and had to devalue the currency to pay public sector wages. I'm not saying Saudi is there, no one did that, but budget constraints quickly bind. And if you look at the public debt ratios in the region, you saw how they rose rapidly after 2014. In terms of the question, in terms of the projects, I don't tend to think in terms of projects and sectors. I tend to think in terms of what Tim mentioned. Let's look at the environment and let's look at the setup. And yes, I think the fundamental reason, which is also linked to the other question, the fundamental reason why the region does not export, all exporters in the region, in Saudi included, does not export non-oil products, is they don't have the comparative advantage. And the comparative advantage in terms of the cost. I think the cost in the region, I left this chart back in 2018 or 19, where you look at productivity and you look at wages, and wages are too high relative to productivity. And if wages are too high, your costs are too high, and your costs are too high, your final product price is too high, and you're uncompetitive in these tradable sectors. What is the solution? I think, again, you have to do it within the political constraints, where you have a local population that require employment, but also you need to diversify away from oil. One of the proposals is basically to provide to distribute oil wealth to universal income to all citizens. That basically, and then you stop doing public sector jobs that will bring the wage premium in the economy lower, and that will lower the cost of production without impacting, the well-being of individuals, because they're getting, the income that they get from their jobs is not the only income. They're getting additional income from their universal income. But that's probably one solution I can think of, and people can criticize or adopt. We had a whole study group on that session, so a few people were there. That's
Fantastic. We have some questions from Zoom I'll get to, but I just want to reflect on this very nice point about what truly is non-oil in the context of an oil producer. I think you're spot on in saying Saudi Arabia risks getting into what we call a miserating growth if the actual export value of that chemical is less than the oil subsidy that goes into the chemical itself. So there's been many efforts towards energy price reform in the country that would actually, we would say we don't actually know the competitiveness of the chemical sector today, because we haven't been able to tease out the oil subsidy contribution to those sectors. And SABIC continues to remain into basic chemicals in which often some of those dynamics and the correlation with oil prices is quite strong in those sectors themselves. But there are chemical laboratories in which trained scientists are there whose value add is more than the oil component there. So it's by no means a one-off, and it is that exact perspective you shared, which is how do we differentiate between oil contributions and the know-how and human value contributions. That is the key lens there. I think the mega projects, again, we would take that tradable, non-tradable lens, and we would say that focusing on tourism and having fewer Saudi tourists go abroad and keeping vacations local offers some potential to increase that sector. That sector is much larger globally than it has been in Saudi Arabia, with the exception of Mecca Medina. And there is significant potential to increase tourism there. Is that potential infinite? Absolutely not. So this dynamic of not looking at tourism as a construction project, looking at it as a service-based industry is a bit muddled in some of the current plans of some of those mega giga projects. And then there's some advanced manufacturing zones and cities that have been planned that, if diversification is to succeed, it will require a well-coordinated strategy towards entering these new sectors that we think have more hope in that space as well. But yes, please, the Zoom questions.
A lot of questions on Zoom. We'll try to take 2 rounds. I'll give you 3 questions each round. So, first question to Ziad: given the fiscal dynamics and social contract constraints you explained, how do you think investors in the capital market are taking these pressure into assessing Saudi's sovereign risk, if they are taking them? To Tim, how do you think Saudi can better measure the trade-off between Saudization and diversification? And then for both of you, if the Vision 2030 is not going great, it's easy to criticize, but how can it work? What should Saudi do differently?
Right. So in terms of the risk from investors, I think the main thing they look at is the price of oil. And essentially, if the price of oil is high, these risks are limited. Oil prices drop, these risks are magnified, and people start looking at the budget deficit, and they start looking at the future and the growth and so on. But so far, I think the summary statistic for Saudi sovereign risk is oil prices. In terms of the last question, which I cannot remember.
What can they do differently?
What can they do differently? So I think, again, my starting point is I want this. succeed, and I want Saudi to prosper. And it's useful to do this analysis midway because you can course correct. I think you have, if the fundamental constraint is in way. If you really want to diversify, you have to do something about the labor market. Productivity is too low, wages are too high, relative to productivity, and it shows up in multiple things. And it shows up in non-competitiveness in non-export sector. And you need to deal with that. How there are multiple things, but you need to bring the gap between productivity and wages closer. You can do that either by increasing productivity, or you can do that by lowering wages. But that's not a technical economic solution. That requires thinking about the general political implications of this. And that's why it is slightly more difficult than increasing the VAT rate or labor use.
And let me reflect on the saudization versus diversification. Very nice question. So there, we think of there's different ways of measuring light, right? A lot of us think of the intensity of light. Is this light on? How bright is it? And what we are trying to encourage is thinking of the spectrum of light. The light comes in many different colors, and we actually think about this spectrum in terms of saudization. Right now, a lot of saudization policy assumes that there's two inputs to labor: Saudi and expat, and says, okay, we have too many expats in this sector, we need to replace them with more Saudis, and assumes fundamentally in a lot of the policies that they are substitutes. And what we have found is that expat workers and Saudi workers largely exist in different sectors, have different skill sets, and have very little evidence of Saudi ready ability for Saudi workers to be able to substitute expat workers. So the way at the Growth Lab we think is, in terms of that spectrum of light, is that actually the alphabet has 26 different letters. And if you think of the world as a game of Scrabble in which you have all of these different areas of capabilities or know-how, that you have engineers is different than your lawyer is different than your dentist, and you're actually able to understand the words that you're able to produce using all of the different know-how in different heads. And then we begin to say, how, essentially if you have a anesthesiologist without a surgeon is about as good as me. I can help put you to sleep, but I can't operate that operation. And so if we think about the world that way, you should be in an ideal labor market where if you don't have a Saudi surgeon, you can simply replace that with an expat. But you will not get to that policy and to solve that Saudi surgeon through a policy that assumes that you can simply substitute that worker with a Saudi in the short run. So a lot of the focus of policy is a constraint to diversification because it restricts your ability to solve for the missing letters in order to create more complex words in that location. So thinking away from simply the intensity of light or how many expats are in the economy, and thinking of the world in terms of we need different skill sets to be here, and expats will play a significant role in trying to achieve higher wages and higher goals for Saudis. And how do we maximize the complex industries we can be competitive in by bringing in that talent from abroad would be a different way of thinking of it. And I think Saudi deserves credit for reforming the kafala system and some of the other immigration systems to move precisely in this direction. And we think that there's more that can be done in this space. We are over time. We're happy to stay and answer any additional questions, but very much thank everyone for joining, for Yongab for coordinating, and for Ziad for this very intriguing talk. We should be having more of these talks around Harvard and around the world. Thank you.